It is a fierce legal battle. Here it is. If you're in New York and you're a homosexual and you're a bartender, you can refuse service to a Republican or a born-again Christian or somebody you don't like with impunity, no problem. If you happen to live in California and you run a bakery and you happen to be a born-again Christian and you say, I don't want to bake a cake for a homosexual wedding, you can go to jail. Now, which way should it be? Well, Arizona passed a bill that wanted to say, well, that baker shouldn't be prosecuted for following his religious beliefs. But the governor has just vetoed that measure, and the threats were that you will lose the Super Bowl in Phoenix. Terry.
In the end, the governor of Arizona said she thought the bill wasn't necessary in her state, and she vetoed it. Charlene Israel has the story.
Opponents of the legislation called it a form of legalized discrimination, and Republican Governor Jan Brewer agreed. Brewer vetoed the measure, saying that if passed, it had the potential to cause more problems than it would solve.
The bill is broadly worded and could result in unintended and negative consequences.
The measure was designed to protect the religious beliefs of businesses and organizations and let them deny services to homosexuals if those beliefs were being violated.
We want for people to be able to have their belief systems respected.
The proposal divided Republicans. Some argued it wasn't about discrimination, but about protecting religious freedom. Republican Senator Steve Yarborough said, quote, "This bill is not about allowing discrimination. This bill is about preventing discrimination against people who are clearly living out their faith." And in a statement, Republican State Senator Al Melvin said, "I'm sure it was a difficult choice for her, but it is a sad day when protecting liberty is considered controversial." Over the past few days, several prominent Republicans, like former GOP presidential nominee Mitt Romney, urged Brewer to reject the bill. And one of the first people to congratulate her on her decision was Republican Senator John McCain. Also on the side of the opposition, the National Football League, Major League Baseball, and the Hispanic National Bar Association, all citing concern that the law would hurt the state's economy by driving away business. The controversial bill came after two gay wedding-related lawsuits in Oregon and New Mexico. In those cases, state courts sided with gay couples instead of Christian business owners. But Brewer said she didn't know of any cases in Arizona where religious freedom had been violated. Charlene Israel, CBN News.
Well, what's happening in America is we have changed the fundamental way we view morality. We've gone away from a biblically based standard to a standard based on what Hollywood has to say, or Madison Avenue, or whoever. And it looks like there was overwhelming opposition to gay marriage, and that has now shifted, so probably a majority of Americans say, well, it's okay. If gays want to get married, that's their business. Well, Americans are worried that our country is losing its religious freedom. And John Jessup has that story from Washington. Here's John.
Pat, that's right. Most people think religious liberty in America is facing a downturn. That's according to a new survey from Lifeway Research. The poll finds 54% of Americans say religious liberty is on the decline, and 50% say Christians in the country are increasingly being subjected to intolerance. Texas is the latest state to have a ban on same-sex marriage struck down, at least for now. A federal judge ruled that a voter-approved amendment banning same-sex weddings is unconstitutional. The judge did, however, issue a stay in the case, so the ban remains in effect until there's a ruling by an appeals court later this year.
This is an issue where there are good people on both sides of the issue, and as the court pointed out today, today's ruling is just one step along the pathway toward resolving this.
Texas Governor Rick Perry condemned the ruling in a statement, saying it is not the role of the federal government to overturn the will of our citizens. The 10th Amendment guarantees Texas voters the freedom to make these decisions, and this is yet another attempt to achieve, via the courts, what couldn't be achieved at the ballot box. Federal judges have recently struck down gay marriage bans in Utah, Oklahoma, and Virginia. Those decisions are also under appeal. Well, dozens of heavily armed gunmen took over government buildings in the region of Crimea in Ukraine. They support Russia and raised the Russian flag over the buildings, including Parliament. Crimea has long been close to Russia, and many people there still speak the language. CBN's George Thomas is on the scene and reports why many in the region still have strong allegiances to Russia.
In southern Ukraine, along the shores of the Black Sea, another political crisis grows as pro-Russian demonstrators welcome the installation of a Russian mayor in this Ukrainian city.
Sevastopol is a legendary Russian city, and it must stay that way.
This is former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych's territory, and his followers are angry at his overthrow.
A bunch of bandits have taken over Kiev, and we will not obey their laws or recognize them here.
Crimea began as part of Russia, then became part of Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ethnic Russians make up about 60% of the population. Since Yanukovych's impeachment, a growing number of them want to separate from Ukraine and rejoin Russia.
Yes, I am willing to fight and go to war against those fascists in Kiev.
On Wednesday, ethnic Muslims who support Ukraine clashed with demonstrators in Simferopol, who were calling for stronger ties with Russia. At least 20 people were injured. While anti-Ukrainian sentiments are at an all-time high here, so too are anti-American feelings.
How do you feel about America?
I think bad of America because they got involved in the conflict situation in Ukraine. We blame them. Go back to America. Get out of Sevastopol. The Russian city of Sevastopol. Get out. That's it.
Crimea is of huge strategic importance to Russia. It's home to Russia's Black Sea naval fleet.
The change in government in Kiev has raised some serious questions about Russia's continued presence here in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol. The Russian Navy has some 25,000 personnel stationed here.
They need to be here to protect the city, especially with all that's going on in the country.
Carrying banners reading "God bless Russia" and "Save Sevastopol," thousands of Crimeans continue to meet each night in the city square, asking Russia to help protect their territory from terrorists and fascists coming from Ukraine. George Thomas, CBN News on the Crimean Peninsula.
Pat, the situation there is extremely tenuous.
Well, you know, some commentator has said what you're looking at is a bunch of old men pensioners, and they don't really have any influence, and they're hardly going to change the situation, and that's really who's there, a bunch of retirees and pro-Russian activists. Remember the Crimean War? That was that disaster that the Great Britain got into, and the charge of the Light Brigade, as I recall, was in the Crimea, where the noble people charged into the Russian guns. So it was Britain versus Russia in the Crimea. So they're still at it, you know.
Could they, I mean, that's a very separate little entity at the bottom of Ukraine. Could they partition that off and just let it
They can always
be
try
Russian?
something.
I mean,
you know, then Putin will have an excuse to say, look, these are Russians. They're calling to me for support, so I'm bringing troops in. And that would be horrible, and that's the excuse that Hitler used in the Czechoslovakia. And, you know, he said, well, these people are actually German citizens, and we need to go in to protect them, and away they went. The next thing you know, they partitioned Czechoslovakia. I don't think well, I don't know what the America will do any longer. You can't count on America doing anything. But you'd think the Western powers would say no to Putin, and I think that's what they're going to do. But amazing, you know, in today's news, there was a Russian ship, a frigate in Havana Harbor. The Russian president called up about 120,000 troops to active duty, and they're marching back and forth along the border to show strength. The question is whether there's enough will in the Western powers, Germany, France, United States, Great Britain, and so forth, to say, no, you can't do this. And I think that's the way it is right now. John?
Pat, President Obama is taking over powers that should belong to Congress. That's a warning from constitutional experts and some members of Congress. In a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee, liberal legal professor Jonathan Turley warned that even though he criticized President Bush for taking over too much power, President Obama is accelerating that trend. The Washington Free Beacon reports he said it could threaten the country. Frankly, he says, I am very alarmed by the implications of that aggregation of power. This can be a dangerous change in our system. And legal professor Elizabeth Price Foley warned that the president is making Congress irrelevant. She said, we are a country of law and not of men. It's going to render Congress superfluous. She said if Congress wants to stay relevant, it should not stand by and let the president take away its power. Pat?
Well, who's letting the president? His name is Harry Reid. He is the majority leader of the Senate, and they talk about the Congress being supine. Well, he is a lapdog of Obama. You know, he was represented, I think, the unions. I don't know whether the gambling interests or others in Las Vegas, but he is a powerful guy behind the scenes, and he has bottled up dozens and dozens of pieces of legislation. The House of Representatives sends bills over and they die in Harry Reid's Senate. And then he turns around and blames the Republicans for not doing anything. Well, it's a sad state when you have complicity between one man in the Senate, one man, and a president who was a community organizer. And the two are doing everything they can to move power away from the elected representatives into a cabal in Washington. It's a very dangerous trend, ladies and gentlemen. They're subverting the Constitution of the United States. And it is very dangerous. We got all upset about Richard Nixon and what his people did. This is much bigger. John?
Pat, the House committee investigating the IRS targeting of conservative groups is recalling former IRS official Lois Lerner. The committee sent a letter to Lerner's attorney requesting she appear before the panel next week to answer questions. American Center for Law and Justice Chief Counsel Jay Sekulow says the decision to recall Lerner to testify is not only appropriate, but necessary to get to the bottom of this unlawful targeting scheme. Last May, Lerner refused to answer questions before the panel. President Obama has promised to reform the NSA's controversial phone spying program. The data collection has been a public relations nightmare for the White House, and critics say the administration is out of control. As Dale Hurd explains, the president now has some choices to make.
Lawyers for the White House have given the president 4 options for restructuring the National Security Agency's phone surveillance program. That, according to the Wall Street Journal. The options range from dropping the spy program altogether to running it through telephone companies. Faced with an international firestorm over the spy program, the president in January asked his staff to give him alternatives.
I believe we need a new approach. The government collection and storage of such bulk data also creates a potential for abuse.
Under the current program, the NSA collects millions of U.S. phone records from phone companies AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint. 3 of the reform options involve who will control the metadata. The 4th scraps the program altogether. Privacy advocates in January said reforming only the telephone spying was not enough.
The only way I think you could limit the NSA is shut down the program entirely and restructure it so that it fits with the Constitution, which is you can't do surveillance on American citizens unless you have a probable cause under the 4th Amendment, which means you have to have some evidence of illegality, and they don't have that.
The hardest thing for the president in this context is the extent to which he cannot satisfy both constituencies, the intelligence community on the one hand, civil liberties advocates and civil liberties organizations on the other.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Those nutrition facts you see on food labels on nearly every package in grocery stores soon will be getting a new look. The changes will emphasize the number of calories with larger, bolder type, and for the first time, they'll also show whether foods have added sugars. In addition, serving sizes will be updated to make them more realistic. For instance, a serving size of ice cream would be listed as twice as big as it is now, going up to a full cup. That's closer to what people normally eat. The new labels are likely at least a couple years away, but the plan is to give Americans a better idea of how much they're really eating and what's in their food. Pat, until then, I guess people can just continue to watch this show.
They can continue to watch our show, to watch Laurie Johnson, our health expert, who's been bringing the facts about sugar to your attention. I did a little demonstration a couple of weeks ago about the sugar that's in these various soft drinks, the sugar that's in our cereals. It is unbelievable how much sugar we consume as a nation, and that's what's leading to type 2 diabetes. It's the sugar. The fat used to be considered the thing, and everybody was looking at cholesterol and how much fat there was, and so we had fat grams, you know, trans fat, and so, well, trans fat's bad for you, but regular fat is not necessarily as bad as they thought. And so we're getting back to Dr. Atkins, who's no longer with us, but Dr. Atkins was saying you can lose weight on a high-fat, high-protein diet, and if you cut out sugars. You know, the thing of yogurt used to be, well, it was low-fat yogurt, but lots of sugar. Mm-hmm. Not the answer any longer.
Yeah. Well, one of the good things Laurie also teaches us is the various names that they now have that they're using for sugar, that if you're not savvy about it, you don't really know what you're eating.
Oh, yeah. High fructose this, and, you know, they've got all those names.
Watch for it.
Yeah. And, well, anyhow, we'll keep you informed, and as soon as the FDA catches up with us, they will keep you informed.
West Virginia's House of Representatives has passed a bill that bans abortion after 20 weeks. The measure easily made it through the chamber Wednesday, 79-17, with some support from Democrats. It blocks late-term abortions unless a woman has life-threatening complications or has suffered permanent physical damage. Opponents argue the bill takes medical options away from women, but pro-lifers in the state point out there are medical exemptions if the mother's life is in danger. The bill now heads to the state Senate. 7 Egyptian Christians reportedly have been killed in the Libyan city of Benghazi. All were young Coptic males between the ages of 17 and 25. According to the Libya Herald, witnesses say militant Islamists forced the Egyptian Christians from an apartment building, bound their hands, and shot each of them in the head. Their bodies were later discovered on a local beach. Christians have faced increased persecution in Libya since the ouster and murder of dictator Muammar Gaddafi more than 2 years ago. Well, you can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com